All right, so let's go ahead and get started because we've got a whole lot of really fun stuff to cover. Welcome to Little Lab. Today, we are going to be talking about a really cool way to kind of explore and connect to nature, as well as kind of a really fun art project and way to reflect the world around you. We're going to talk about building miniature landscapes. Now, when I say like miniature or mini, like a mini landscape, what do I mean by that? What does mini mean? We can spell it in the chat here. Yeah, exactly, Evelyn. Tiny or small. Yes, I'm going to be making kind of a tiny version of a landscape. There's a few different ways that we can do this. We're going to go over two of them today. The first one we're going to go over is just is a beautiful way to make more like an art project, and it's kind of inspired by a few different Japanese traditional practices, including saike, which is it translates to a planted landscape. It's something where we take all of the elements from nature that are still living, we plant them in a miniature format and create a tiny landscape. It's also kind of similar to bonsai, which is planting and curating a very small tree, though traditionally bonsai doesn't include the whole landscape. There's also going to be a few elements of bankei in it, which is related to all of those and translates to dry planting, right? It's just sort of like you have, you're depicting a scene from nature, a landscape, but you're not keeping those plants alive. It's just about kind of creating the small landscape. So we're going to start out just creating a landscape. This is one where we're going to use natural materials, but we're not going to worry about keeping them alive. That'll be the second form that we'll explore later. So I know that we got out a little late, a cool list of stuff for you guys to collect. Is anyone going to be doing the experiment along with us today? You going to be building with us? Max, you're going to be building with us? That's great.
I will, yeah.
Yeah, did anyone go out and collect any natural materials? What do you think? If you did, feel free to share it with us in the chat.
And you can let us know what you found if you'd like. I think Peregrine and I are going to talk about what we found when we went looking for stuff. If you haven't had that chance yet, that is okay. You can do that after today's session too.
This is something that you can do at any time of the year, any time of the day, give or take, and something that you can do outdoors, indoors, all sorts of places. I'll show you just a few of the things that I got from outside. I found this really cool, this very old dried out stump. So I have some beautiful pieces of wood that look really cool. I found some little pieces of a shrub that kind of looked like a tiny tree to me, so I thought it might be a good place to start. I found some little pieces of birch bark. I found some rocks outside, some little rocks. I found some dirt, some soil. Found a pine cone. Maybe we found some leaves and sticks and flowers and rocks. That's good. Max, I think I heard that you got some flowers as well. Is that right?
I found some pretty cool stuff. And, I think there's something really neat to be said for going out and looking for stuff. That observation and that search, that exploration, those are all really important early science process skills. And one thing that the search for cool looking stuff that we can use to make a landscape does is it makes you take a look at it as though nature is art, which nature is art. And we're going to use all of these different artistic materials that we're finding out there to make a cool landscape. So I went out and I looked in an interesting place. I just looked in the cracks in between the bricks on the outside of my building. I found a lot of stuff. I found some moss. I found a few different types of moss. There's some really neat ones here. I found some ferns that were growing in there that I was able to get some of the stuff out. I found some cool rocks that I really like. I'm also going to be using some shells that I already had, which I'm excited to integrate those into mine. And then I also found some flowers that had fallen off of a tree. And when I was out exploring and looking for these materials, it really did help me take a new way of looking at the nature out there, because usually I would not look in the cracks in between the bricks on my building. But today I think I found some really beautiful stuff, and I'm excited to see what I can do with it. If you haven't gone out yet, or even if you already have, when you try this experiment again, I encourage you to look in some of those strange and unusual places that you might not think to look first.
A lot of times we pay attention to the stuff that's big and beautiful and right in front of us, but a lot of times there's things on the really small scale, and the smaller we look, the more kind of surprising, wonderful things that we see. That's kind of part of the point of making these miniscapes is to start looking small and thinking small. What we're recreating is something big, right, on a small scale. So a lot of what we'll be thinking about is actually a math process, right? We're thinking about scale, and we're thinking about how do big things relate to one another, right? Like if I have a tree and a flower, they're not going to be the same size, right? So if I am scaling them down, if I'm imagining I'm taking a big thing and making it small, how big does it need to be compared to all of the other things in my landscape? So if I want to create a tree in my landscape and I want to create a flower in my mini landscape, I want to make sure that my tree, my mini tree, is not smaller than my mini flower, right? So we're going to go ahead and get started with this idea. The first thing we want to start with in our mini landscape that we're not worried about, keeping it alive. We're just kind of building, and we can, of course, rebuild these and reorganize them. We want to start with some soil. So we have a container and some soil. I have a little box here, and I have some soil in it. I'm actually going to switch to my jar cam here.
Jar cam.
Jar cam. It's a cam in a jar. Very nice. So you can sort of see in here, I'm using some potting soil for this. So you can see it has a lot of these little perlite pieces. And I like the way that they look. I think that they look a little bit like gravel, like small rocks. If I really want to, I can practice some really good fine motor skills. I can work on picking out all of these little rocks and moving them to a different place. I've also done this with tweezers before. So if you have any of those, it is I find it a very meditative process. It's something where I can just kind of let my mind wander, and I can imagine all sorts of fun things while I'm doing this task. But I also like the way that they look in here. So when I'm making a landscape, I want to imagine what it's going to look like. I'm going to visualize it. What do you guys think? If you were going to build a miniscape, a mini landscape, what do you think you might want to build? Do you have any favorite places in nature that you might want to recreate?
That's a good question. And a note for caretakers, again, as y'all think about it and type it into the chat box, this intuitive math of scaling is another very important early science process skill. Figuring out how to scale things properly so that it looks like a nice little diorama almost, a representation of a real landscape, is a really important imaginative and mathematical skill.
So I'm recreating kind of like a forest scene. So what I want to include are some rocks, right? And I want to create some small trees as well. Most of what I have is going to look good as a small tree, right? So I'm going to kind of put that in here, and I'm thinking about the size of my rock in relation to the size of my tree. I see you have some moss. I have some of that as well.
Moss is really, really neat for this because moss is such an interesting group of plants. And one thing that makes moss so good for these is that even when moss dries out, usually it'll keep some of its color. It'll stay kind of green or light green or dark green, or sometimes it'll dry out and turn brown. But one interesting thing about moss is that it's really hardy. It's a really, really tough plant, so a lot of them can dry out almost completely, and then if you give them long enough time, give them the right amount of water and sunlight, sometimes those mosses can come back to life, which I think is pretty neat. And we'll talk more about keeping our stuff alive when we move into the second part of what we're talking about.
That is a great detail, Max. I love that we're thinking about a version that's a diorama, a version that's not living, but also looking at, oh, I love those ferns. Those are so cool. Looking at ways that we can keep them alive. So I've created just a really quick kind of small version of my forest. The thing about when we're building small is that the more detail there is, the more kind of real it looks. I love that kind of moss there that has all of those kind of tiny little shoots because it looks like grass. And if we're scaling it against a larger kind of plant or twig like this, it will be the right size of grass compared to a larger tree, right? That's really good. That looks great. So there's lots of different ways that I could arrange this and rearrange this. I'm thinking about the different, how all of the different plants that I have can fit in there, how I can layer them carefully together to look like a really nice little scene.
And there's an expert art form in creating these mini landscapes that Peregrine talked a little bit about, and they get down to so much detail and are working in such tiny little areas that instead of just using their hands, which is a great way to start the process, they also might use sticks or chopsticks or dowels in order to move things around very gently inside of their landscape. And you can give that a try too. How can you move stuff around more effectively with one of these sticks? What can you do with it? And I'm trying to press some of my moss down right now with it.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Something else I like to do too is if you have a paintbrush or even a toothbrush, an old toothbrush like this, it's really good for gently brushing the dirt off of your moss. It's just it feels very satisfying and nice to focus on these tiny details to make this miniature landscape kind of come alive. Before we move to our kind of next form of mini landscapes, I just wanted to give you one more fun thing that I like to do when I am creating a mini landscape. I love to also create a sense of scale using tiny toys like this one. So if you have any tiny figures or action figures, I have this little cat, and I can place this cat into my landscape. And the cat is the right size that it doesn't make the tree look weirdly tiny. It doesn't, it's not like it's a giant cat in my tiny landscape. It's just something that's the right size for my toy. Is that an eagle or an
They're
owl?
all owls. I put a couple of owls in here, and one thing that I like that lets us to do is it helps you move it from being a nice landscape to almost even trying to tell a story. So as you're putting more stuff in there, you can figure out a name for what this area is called. You can try and figure out a story, and then you can make that story using your little action figures. I'm going to shut my camera off, and I'm going to see if I can show you what I've made. Let me see if I can figure this out.
That sounds really
Peregrine,
good.
I'd love to see yours up close.
So I will take my jar cam and I'll put it a little bit closer. And you can see my kind of little visual storytelling here. And the more I kind of put different plants and different rocks around it, the more detail it has. Right, here's another form of plant that I can do. Because when you think about when you go out in nature, oh, that looks so nice. When you go out in nature, there's so many different kinds of plants around. So the more we have and the different kinds that we have, the more it reflects a real landscape. That looks really beautiful, Max.
Thank you.
I love the way that you have scattered those flowers around. That pop of color is something that really helps to move my eye around that piece.
Thank you, Peregrine. I appreciate
I love that.
I don't know if all the plants in there will stay alive, but it'll stay looking really cool for a little while, and that's what really matters to me right now, is that I'd like to make a little piece of temporary art that might stay alive for a little bit longer, that maybe I can keep alive by spraying some dechlorinated water on it. But for now, I'm really, really happy with it, and I can keep going back and working on it and moving the pieces around and changing my story and my landscape if I want to. It's a really nice, I think you said it really, really beautifully. It's a nice meditative activity. It's very calming, and it's nice and imaginative, as well as having all these cool science process skills. Peregrine, tell us a little bit more about the other piece that we were going to talk about today.
So we're also going to talk about if we want to make a mini landscape that can stay alive, there's a way that we can do that in a closed container. And we're just going to kind of quickly go through what that might look like. I have a container here. It's a plastic container and it's waterproof, and that's important because there's something that plants need in order to stay alive. While I'm doing my first step, I want you to tell me, what things do plants need in order to stay alive?
And you can put that into the chat. The question again is, what do plants need to stay alive? One other thing that I think is so neat about this is that you use potting soil, Peregrine. I used soil that I dug up from outside. And in that soil, one thing that I'm sure is true is that there are teeny tiny little seeds that I have not found. And if I water them properly and give them enough of what they need, which I think people are telling us right now in the chat, some of those might pop up. Some of those might start growing inside of my small landscape. All right, let's see what people said. Oh my goodness. So
So
somebody said water and sunlight and air and soil. These are excellent. One
those are
thing I'll
really,
push
those are
back
exactly right.
on is that soil, a lot of plants need soil, but remember, my plants that I took, that moss and those ferns, they were just growing on rocks. They were growing on bricks. So soil is a great answer because most plants that we know do need to be in soil, but some of them, like this little air plant, they can just grow out in the air. This one still has roots, but it doesn't grow in the soil, which is pretty neat.
So some plants don't even need soil. The ones that I collected, I think, do need soil, right? And this is a great term here, photosynthesis. That's what plants use to feed themselves when they take water and sunlight and a gas called carbon dioxide, and they create food for themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. If we want to create plants that live, that photosynthesize and do all of these things, we're going to start with a container that can hold water, since they will need water, and the ones I have will also need soil. I'm going to start with not soil but rocks. I have some little rocks here that are going to make a noise when I pour them. Some little rocks here that are going to be kind of my first layer of my mini landscape. And this one is a little different since it's something that's going to keep growing. We're going to call it a terrarium. My terrarium needs something called a false bottom. We need a place for the water to collect without keeping the soil all soggy. So we want to kind of separate where the water will collect at the bottom and the area where the soil will be. So I'm going to use rocks. You can also use another barrier to separate your soil and rock layer. Like I recently screened in my porch, so I have a little bit of this just regular screen. You can also kind of poke tiny holes in a plastic bag or some plastic wrap. It's something that won't biodegrade, it won't break down, and it will create a good barrier between these layers to keep your plants healthy. So I'm going to put a little bit of that in there. And now I said my plants need soil, so I'm going to add the soil. And to do that, I'm going to switch my can here. So as Max mentioned, there's different things in the soil that are going to be really important for keeping plants alive. I can use some potting soil here, right? Some potting soil that I had left over from plants that I got at the store. But I also want to use some of the dirt from outside, because inside of this dirt, there's an entire tiny, even tinier, right, world than the mini landscape we're creating. All of the things in here will be really helpful for creating things that our plants need to stay alive. We mentioned that plants need a certain gas. They need a gas called carbon dioxide, and that helps them to photosynthesize, to make their own food. And all of the different things living in here, like the tiny bacteria, will help create that gas that they need. So I've got my soil here. I've got my soil layer. I've got it on top of my false bottom. And now I'm going to add my plants, kind of like we did before. I'm creating a miniature landscape, but now I'm thinking about what plants can I keep alive. So I'm thinking I'm going to use some of this moss. Right, I'm going to kind of plant some of this moss in here. I did pick up some little kind of tiny seedlings, right? I made sure that I have a little bit of their roots still, just to see if they'll be able to grow. And I'm going to take some different kinds of moss that I have. I have some of these guys here. And I'm going to kind of do the same thing. I'm creating a miniature landscape. And I'm really excited to see if any of these plants take root, if they continue to grow, or if there are any kind of hidden seeds inside of the soil that I've collected already. That would be really exciting. Mm-hmm. So I've created this landscape, and now it needs, it's got its soil, it's got right now some of the gases that it needs. Oh, this is such a cool addition. It sounds like Nora made a paper pine tree. That's perfect. That's exactly what bouquet is, right? Creating those natural materials out of different things. That's so cool. I love that. For keeping these guys alive, we're going to do, what we're going to do is we're actually going to seal them up. right? We're gonna give them a little bit of water and we're gonna cover them. Now, a container like this, I could use its lid to cover it. I could use some plastic wrap to cover it. If you've got something like a little jar, right, that's another great place to make a terrarium, because we wanna seal inside of here our plants, our soil, and a little bit of water. I've got a little water here that I left out overnight so that it could become dechlorinated, right? It just made it so it's easier for the plants to survive using this water that's been sitting out. I'm gonna add a little bit of this water, and I'm using a pipette or an eyedropper. But you could pour this water, you could use a sprayer. A sprayer would probably be perfect. But I'm just using what I have. I'm adding some water, and then I will cover it up. And it will be able to live all by itself, all covered up, this tiny contained little environment, because it has water. The plants will use the water. The plants will photosynthesize, they'll make their own food, and plants give off water too. Once they've used it all up in their photosynthesis process, they will transpire. They'll push little bits of water vapor out. That water, right, will evaporate, but it'll be trapped by the lid that we have on this. So we're gonna create our own kind of miniature water cycle inside of here, and it'll be able to keep itself going for a long time. In fact, Max, you have a landscape, a little terrarium like this that you've made and kept for a long time. Can you show it to us?
Yeah, today was a really special one for me, Peregrine, because I love making terrariums. I used to make a lot of them as gifts for people. And you can keep them and leave them, and they'll keep themselves going for a really, really, really long time. This is the last one that I've had, and this one is special to me because it's been alive inside of this jar for about 10 years. So this is a whole little self-contained little world in here that keeps itself alive, that I open up usually about 4 times a year to add a little bit of more water. But usually I just keep this lid on top of it. And you can take a look at my different layers that Peregrine was talking about here. Most of them have kind of mixed together, but you can see my pebbles. I have some charcoal here at this layer, which helps to filter out the water, and then I have my soil layer. But the plants that are in here, it's really just mosses. If you can't tell, I think that mosses are really, really, really neat. But I have a few different types that are living in here. And then it's been such a long time that some algae, some plants that live in water, also have started living in here too. Today is a special day, so I was thinking maybe it would be cool to open it up and see what it looks like inside. Does that sound cool to everybody?
You only open it up 4 times a year, and we get to see inside of it. I'm really excited to see it.
Okay, I'm gonna close up my camera. What do you think it'll look like inside, though? Because I'm gonna get my camera ready and I'm gonna do a view of inside. What does
Inside of this
everybody think
terrarium,
it'll
I'm
look
thinking
like
it's going to look like a
inside?
jungle. I think it's going to look really beautiful and kind of grown and green. I think there's going to be different kinds of moss. Whoa!
This is the inside, and you can see still some of the rocks that I put in there about 10 years ago. But most of it is just these mosses that have grown up. And you don't usually see mosses that have these long tendrils around here because most mosses can't compete with the other plants around them, so they can't really get this sort of large and healthy looking. But this terrarium that I've made is just a nice little home for just these mosses that live in there. And you can see they're growing up against the side of the glass. You can see a little bit of that kind of spidery algae in there. But you can see moss in a way that is really, really beautiful, in a way that we don't often get to look at it. And so I was really excited about today's little lab, Peregrine.
You've created your own kind of special little environment that's really unique. I love that. Thank you for giving us that rare peek into your 10-year-old terrarium. That is so cool that you've kept it going for that long and that it is self-sustaining. It has the ability to keep itself alive if we give it what it needs. So we've gone over a few different ways that you can create the landscapes around you in miniature, making them small. You can create sort of more like a diorama or a psyche, kind of like little environment here that we're not too worried about keeping those plants alive. We're just using different elements, including sometimes some small toys. And we also talked about ways that we can keep plants living for a really long time inside of a closed environment. That is so cool. My friends, we've gone a bit over, and as usual, you have all been very patient with us, and we really, really appreciate you coming and checking out this little lab. As always, we will send along kind of a materials list that goes over some of the things we talked about, so that you can maybe start your own terrarium or create your own miniature landscape.
And we hope you have fun with this project that mixes art and science. And if you would like to share your creation with us, Peregrine and I would, of course, love to see it.
We would love to. You can do that if you want to share it on social media. You can tag the museum, and you can tag Lab at Home or Little Lab at Home, or both, because we would love to be able to see what you guys make. We love mixing art and science, and we love learning that that all artists are scientists and all art is science, because we're experimenting with a lot of different ideas. Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us today and checking out all of the stuff that we have. I had a lot of fun making these miniature landscapes today with you all.
So long, everybody.